Thank you very much for those kind words and for inviting me here. I learned to my dismay that I had to start the proceedings. It's so much easier to react to what somebody else has been just been saying than to have to come up with original thoughts to begin with. But I'll do my best and make a few points rather than give a formal lecture. I share the premise of the previous speaker about the anxieties that are now plaguing many people around the world, which have to do with globalization, with multinational corporations, with transnational bureaucracies, the feeling that many people have, and immigration larger in scale than perhaps ever before, and certainly in Europe, has given many people the feeling that they've lost their grip on who they are, where they belong, who's in charge, who represents you, and so on and so forth. And so one of the great questions, I think, facing all societies, really, today, what are the elements that hold a society together? What is it that makes a society coherent? And some kind of coherence is essential to, especially to maintain a liberal democracy. Now, there are many different things that hold societies together. Traditionally, well, one thing, of course, are common laws. The other thing, traditionally at least, are shared myths, often based on history or passed on through poetry, through the language, and so on. And that, again, is linked to, often in the past, to religious beliefs. The shared religion is another thing that can hold a society together, at least in principle. I'm not the youngest in this room, but certainly not the oldest either. But many of us, certainly people my age, I was born at the end of 1951 in Holland, and many of us can still remember how our history curriculum, certainly at primary school, which hadn't really changed much since the 19th century, since my grandfather, who was born not so very far from here, that he had. We were still, history in primary schools in Holland was still essentially passing on national myths. It was about pride in the brave and even heroic resistance against the Catholic tyranny of Spain. Every primary school teacher, of course, had been in the anti-Nazi resistance during the occupation. The Duke of Alva was a widely reviled and villainous figure, and so on. Now, of course, if I'd been at a primary school in the south of Holland and to be a Roman Catholic, things would have been a little bit more problematic and perhaps somewhat different. But these were the myths that I still grew up in, the brave, heroic nation, Protestant nation, essentially, of great resistors against foreign tyrannies, particularly Spain and our German neighbour. And it was also, this is something many people forget when they compare the wonderful secularization of Europe in contrast, not only, of course, to the Middle East, but in contrast to the United States, which is widely disdained by many Europeans for still being in the grip of all kinds of primitive religious beliefs. It's forgotten how recently European societies were still in the grip of religion as well, because at the same time that I and many of you here learned about the brave resistance against Catholic tyranny, you couldn't really listen to the radio on Sunday unless you wanted to listen to sermons all day long. And this was not long ago. This is a question of decades, not more. This is a profoundly religious country. And I would argue that even though people don't go to church in large numbers anymore, it's still the attitude fed by religious belief is still very visible, even in, well, not even, especially in the debates unleashed by the so-called challenge of Islam. And sometimes the most religious attitudes are to be found amongst those who are most vehemently opposed to religion, I might add. In the US, which doesn't have as long a history as Europe, and where the common identity, the common values cannot really be defined by things like poetry, a shared history, shared language, and so on and so forth, there is a much more, I would say, political sense of common identity. It's very simple to everybody in America, everybody who immigrates in the United States, what it means to be an American. It's essentially a matter of citizenship. It's a matter of loyalty to the Constitution, loyalty to the flag, it's loyalty to shared political institutions, and it doesn't matter what the culture or creed is that you practice at home. In public, your public persona as an American is essentially a political one. But it's of course also more than that. And it's also the shared myths play a role there too, in the sense that the United States, like France, and these are the two democracies in the West that most resemble each other in that way. Both the US and France are republics that emerged from revolutions, and both in different ways have adopted a civic religion of a kind that doesn't really exist in countries like the Netherlands or Britain or Germany. Rousseau was one of the thinkers before the French Revolution who proposed that what was needed in a republic was a civic religion, a common belief as well as a common loyalty to the republic. And I think this is very, very true in the US as well. The myth, if you like, is this idea of the unique freedom of the American Republic, which is almost a question of faith as much as it is anything else. And both the French and the Americans, of course, are convinced that their values, since they come from the Enlightenment, they come from Republican revolutions, are therefore also, in the tradition of the Enlightenment, are also universal, which is one reason why the Americans and the French so often can't stand each other, because it's very difficult to have two republics that both claim that their civic religions and their shared values are universal. One has to give, even though, of course, both have quite a lot in common, and it's a love-hate relationship between France and the United States for that very reason. In Europe, I think it's the rest of Europe, but I might include France in this too, but for the sake of argument, I'll keep France in a separate box with the United States. The rest of Europe, it's tougher to define in modern days, in the days of globalization, mass immigration, challenge from other non-Western religions, and so on. It's harder to define what it is that holds us together. And so we find, sponsored by various governments, in my view, somewhat pathetic search for Dutchness, Britishness, Frenchness. I mean, the French government is just as guilty of this as the others. As though there is some kind of essence that if you define it carefully enough, as though you were in a chemistry lab, and you can find an essence that defines what it is to be Dutch or British or German or Spanish or whatever it may be. I think this is rather a fruitless endeavor. I don't think you come up with anything very much. And I think the danger of it is that it excludes people who should be accepted as fellow citizens, as long as they abide by the same laws, of course. And even if they don't that. Some people talk about instilling shared myths. In this country, I suppose, the main proponent of that idea would be somebody like Paul Schäfer, who believes that what is needed to welcome, as he would put it, newcomers, immigrants, whether they're Muslim or not, and accept them as fellow citizens in this country, and he's entirely